Right. So, welcome to Unit 3, Topic 5. So, we'll be discussing photosynthesis. So this will be in three parts. Photosynthesis is a really long process, or at least it takes a long time to understand what the process is. So this will be broken up into three parts. Okay, so to begin, what is photosynthesis? Well, it's simply the conversion of light energy to chemical energy. And this process happens in photoautotrophs, and these are meaning they're specifically using light energy to produce sugar, right? So other autotrophs do exist, and they'll use chemical energy in order to produce their own food. But we're going to be focusing on plants or photoautotrophs. So you can see a couple of examples down at the bottom. So we can see we have the typical plant on the left, and then some seawater algae type plants to the right. And it's important to understand the difference between an autotroph versus a heterotroph. So I already sort of touched on what an autotroph is. So autotrophs are organisms that produce their own food, meaning organic molecules from simple substances in their surroundings. Um, like I mentioned, these can be photoautotrophs that specifically use the energy from the sun, and then we can have chemical autotrophs, which use chemical energy to produce their own organic molecules. So either way, autotrophs are just producing their own food, and then heterotrophs, on the other hand, can't make their own food, so they have to live off of other organisms. So down at the bottom, I have a picture of the little flowers, and then you can see the bunny is a heterotroph, so it has to eat other organisms, those flowers, that can make their own organic molecules, because the bunny can't do that on its own. So it has to eat those organic molecules. So that's the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now let's go ahead and delve into the evolution of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis first evolved in prokaryotic organisms. And some of the earliest known organisms that went through photosynthesis are cyanobacteria, and there were cyanobacteria found in Australia that were, I want to say, about 3.8-ish billion years ago. And so that's our oldest record of cyanobacteria. And what's believed to have happened is that these they oxygenated the atmosphere of early Earth. So before photosynthesis, the composition of Earth was much different, and we didn't have the abundance of oxygen like we do now before photosynthetic organisms. So these cyanobacteria had the ability to go through photosynthesis, and then they're the ones who most likely oxygenated the early Earth. And now we know that organisms like us have to go through cellular respiration, so we depend upon that oxygen now. So without having had this transition to an oxygenated Earth, we wouldn't have had this, or this potentially wouldn't have ever had cellular respiration, and we wouldn't be here. Now, prokaryotic uh, photosynthetic pathways were the foundation of eukaryotic photosynthesis, right? So over time, as things evolved, eukaryotes began to be able to go through photosynthesis as well. So in terms of the site of photosynthesis, leaves are going to be the primary location of photosynthesis in most plants. And the organelle that we care most about for photosynthesis is the chloroplast, right? And we talked about chloroplasts in Unit 2. Remember, these are organelles that are located, that are the location for photosynthesis. So this image down at the bottom is zooming in on that leaf, and there you go. You can see a microscopic image of the cells and inside. And here we're going to look into mesophyll. So mesophyll are cells that make up the interior tissue of the leaf. So this image you can see, right, we're zooming in on the tissue. So then we can actually see the cells. Now also in plants, we have stomata. right? And these are going to be pores in the leaves that allow for gas exchange. So it's going to allow CO2 in, and then it's going to allow oxygen out. So plants need carbon dioxide to go through photosynthesis, and then they release oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. And we'll get into the specifics of that in a little bit when we go through the actual reactions in photosynthesis. All right, so let's go through the structures of a chloroplast in a little bit more depth. So again, we're zooming in even more into this image on the left, so to specifically focus on the chloroplast. So chloroplasts are surrounded by a double membrane, as we learned previously, and they have their form of cytoplasm, but it's called stroma. So this is, just think, it's the aqueous internal fluid, so think like cytoplasm, because basically that's what it is. Now we also have thylakoids, and those are going to be represented by those green circles that you see in this stroma. And they'll stack together, and when they form stacks, the stacks are known as grana. Now inside each thylakoid is the lumen, which you can see in that image on the bottom right. And we're going to talk about what can happen in there in a little bit. And now there's this beautiful green color because of chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is a pigment that is in the thylakoid membranes, and we're going to delve into the importance of pigments, how pigments interact with light, and also what they do for photosynthesis. So how do they actually, or how does chlorophyll actually provide a benefit, or what is its role in photosynthesis? So we'll talk about that. But we're going to look at the formula for photosynthesis as well. So for photosynthesis, so the simplified formula is this. So we see that our reactants are carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, and then our products are going to be glucose and oxygen. And now if we look at an unsimplified version of the formula, we're going to just really quickly track where these molecules go. So from the reactants to the products, how do we get here? Well, the carbon of our carbon dioxide is going to, we can trace it to the glucose, right? The oxygen and carbon dioxide can be found in both the glucose and the water. And the products, and then the water and the reactants goes to the glucose, the water and the oxygen. Again, this is a non-simplified version of the formula. And you can see the water and the reactants. So it's taken out because it's simplified. But when we look at the non-simplified formula, this is important because for a really long time, researchers believed that this oxygen right here, the byproduct, so this one right here, they thought that it came from CO2, and again, for a very long time, most of our understanding of plants, we thought that it came from the CO2, which would make sense, right? If you were the researcher, it makes logical sense that, okay, well, carbon dioxide goes in oxygen, leaves, so it must be, coming from that. So we're removing the carbon and then, getting rid of the oxygen. But no, it actually comes from the water, and we'll talk about why this is so important when we get into the process of the light-dependent reactions. So that's why I'm bringing that up. That's why we're talking about tracing where each thing goes, because I want you to keep this in mind before we move into the light-dependent reactions. So this water is responsible for this oxygen, right? So we can keep that in the back of our mind for now. And I'm going to pause this really quickly because I have a class. Okay, sorry, I had to stop in the middle to do a class. I think we were on this slide here. So we just finished this up. Okay, so we were talking about photosynthesis, the reactants, the products. So now we're going to go through a general what happens in photosynthesis, essentially. So in photosynthesis, we're going to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. So two hydrogen and oxygen. And then what's going to happen is a series of what are called redox reactions. And redox reactions are, and they're the complete or partial transfer of one or more electrons from the reactant to another, reactant to another. And we'll talk about this in more depth, but redox reactions are happening in both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So we'll talk about it in this section, and then we'll go back to it when we talk about cellular respiration. But it's just the transfer of electrons. Now, in photosynthesis, the electrons are transferred with protons, and the protons are H plus from the splitting of water, right? So remember, we split water and we get hydrogen and oxygen. And two hydrogen and oxygen, and those hydrogen are going to be hydrogen ions. What's going to happen? The essence of photosynthesis is that these electrons are transferred with these protons to carbon dioxide, and it's eventually going to reduce it to sugar. And again, think of this as like a real overview of photosynthesis, and then we're going to get more into the nitty-gritty of what actually happens and how this happens. So remember, in terms of redox reactions, we have two things happening. So redox reactions mean, actually, so I said it was a process of transferring electrons. In redox reactions, we can have oxidation or reduction, right? Oxidation is going to be the loss of electrons, and there's two ways to remember this. They're taught in college. You have oil rig or you have Leo goes Gur. I like Leo goes Gur just because it's funny. But so I like this, but do what works for you. So this stands for oil rig. Oxidation is loss. Reduction is gain. Leo goes Gur is the same, but just worded differently. So it goes loss of electrons, oxidation. Gain of electrons is reduction. So these are just ways of remembering what it is again, like what oxidation is. It's a loss of electrons, and the reduction is the gain of electrons. And so we're going to see during the redox reactions, things will be reduced and then they'll be oxidized, right? Reduced means they're going to gain electrons. They're going to give them up, so then they become oxidized, and these redox reactions are essential in the light-dependent reactions. All right. So here we'll see reduction. So CO2 is going to be gaining electrons to reduce it to glucose. And then water is going to be oxidized, or it's going to go through oxidation reactions so that we go from water to oxygen. All right, so now in terms of photosynthesis, we have two stages. The two stages are the light reactions and the Kelvin cycle, or the light independent reactions. In terms of the light reactions, they're going to happen here in the thylakoids. And then the Kelvin cycle is going to happen in the stroma, and photosynthesis can be broken down into photo and synthesis, photo referring to the light reactions and synthesis referring to the Kelvin cycle. So again, light reactions happen in our thylakoids, and then the Kelvin cycle happens in the stroma. And then through the process of photosynthesis, we have to understand a little bit about light. So light itself is magnetic energy, and it's made up of little particles called photons. Light is going to travel in waves, and if you took maybe physics before or chemistry before, you might be familiar with this. Wavelengths are how we measure the frequency of whatever we're looking at. So in this case, wavelengths refer to the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next. So what does that mean? I'm going to, essentially, if you draw a wavelength, you can think of it, I can't right now, but if you draw it, it's going to be the distance between the peak and the other peak of the wave. Let me see if I can draw that. Oh, I can. Okay, so if I have a wavelength, we're literally talking about the length between this crest here and this crest here, right? So this is our wavelength. Okay. Right, so it can also be measured through our trough to trough. So it can be measured if we're looking, instead of the crest, we're looking at the trough. Oh, sorry, the trough here and the trough here. This is also a wavelength. It's going to be the same, right? So one to the next, so either one crest to one crest and then one trough. That's how we measure a wavelength. So the entire range, all of our different wavelengths, for example, which we can see here on the image to the right, all of these are known as the electromagnetic spectrum. Because light is electromagnetic energy. So this is the entire spectrum that we can see. Now it's going to range for visible light, but we can also see that there's this little portion right here that's visible light right here. So here's visible light. This is going to be from about 380 nanometers to 700 and something nanometers. And again, that's visible light, so that's what we can see. So I think Roy G. Biv, right, the red, orange, yellow, green, indigo, violet, Roy G. Biv, and blue. There we go. Yeah, Roy G. Biv, Roy, red, orange, yellow, green, Biv, B, blue, indigo, violet. There we go. So Roy G. Biv. So now in terms of wavelengths or long wavelengths, short wavelengths are going to be higher energy. So it's going to look something more like, I can draw this again. So short wavelengths are going to look something like this. Well, these are terrible. And then the long wavelengths, unsurprisingly, will look more like something like that. Ignore this line. That was just a glitch in my thing. So long wavelengths are going to be lower energy, and they're going to look something like this image that I just drew. So when light interacts with matter, there's a few things that can happen. It can be reflected, it can be transmitted, or it can be absorbed. We're going to be focusing on absorption. So pigments are specifically able to absorb visible light. And we already spoke about one pigment, right, that we know of, chlorophyll. There's actually other pigments too, but all of these pigments are able to absorb visible light. And then the colors that we see are actually the wavelengths that are reflected. All right, so this is a little counterintuitive. Some of you may not know this. So leaves are green because chlorophyll absorbs violet, blue, and red light. But we see it as green because it reflects green, right? It doesn't absorb green. So the color that it does not absorb is reflected back at you, and that's why you see that color. But it's not absorbing those colors, right? So let's say right now you have on a blue t-shirt. Your t-shirt is absorbing every other color except for blue. So it's reflecting blue, and that's why you see it as blue. Okay, so remember, what it absorbs is different from what it reflects. We see the color that's reflected. We don't see the colors that are absorbing. Okay. So now let's go ahead and delve into our photosynthetic pigments. So we're going to discuss 3, and here on the graph to the right, we see 2. So the first one we're going to talk about is chlorophyll A. So this is a primary pigment in plants. It's involved in the light reactions. This pigment is a blue-green pigment. So if we find it on the graph over here, you'll see that it's like green. It's the green line. So it peaks right here, and this is the absorption coefficient. And then it also peaks over here. So if it's a blue-green pigment, meaning this is what we see, right? This is what's reflected. Then what colors does it absorb? Well, it's going to absorb, let's see, where does it peak? So it's going to absorb in the purple-blue range and the red range. So it's absorbing, if you see, it's peaking, so it's absorbing in the purplish, like this here, and then it's also absorbing in the red range, if you see that right here. Okay, so it absorbs in the purpley blue and the red, but we see blue and green because that's what it's reflecting. All right, next we have chlorophyll B. This is an accessory pigment because it's not the primary pigment. It's a yellow-green pigment. So here it's represented by the blue line. So we're going to see it peak here at this blue, and then it also peaks over here. So what that means is that it's going to absorb like the light blue and blue colors. And then it's also absorbing, if you see over here, the orangish, maybe a little bit of yellow, orangish, and then red. So it's not the exact same as chlorophyll A. So why do we have two, right? So why do we have this primary one and the accessory one? The accessory one just widens the absorption spectrum, right? So it allows the plant to absorb a little bit more, more different wavelengths than the chlorophyll A. Okay. Oh, so sorry, it's the yellow-green pigment. Sorry. Okay, so there's also the carotenoids, which are, if you think, so there's multiple in here, but I think carrots are what are what color. Like I just think carrots because they're orangish, right? But they brought in the spectrum of colors that drive photosynthesis. So we have a variety of pigments just to increase the absorption spectrum, right? So this is a yellow-orange pigment. Again, think like carrots is orange. So that's the colors that are reflected. So it's going to absorb the different colors and what are reflected. And in addition to broadening the spectrum, it's also allowing for photoprotection. So photoprotection is a way for plants to protect themselves from light. So think about humans. If we go out and sunbathe all the time, the sun damages our skin, obviously. Like plants also experience damage from the sun, just not in the same way, but they can. And so carotenoids help to absorb and dissipate excessive light energy that would only damage their chlorophylls or interact with oxygen. So in college, if any of you are interested in studying the sciences beyond high school, you actually learn that oxygen can form what are called reactive oxygen. Reactive oxygen species. These are free radicals essentially, and free radicals are obviously not, or maybe not obviously, but they're not good. They can cause a lot of harm to the body, and so carotenoids are trying to protect that for the plant because free radicals can also harm plants too. So if you've ever heard of free radicals, like people that are really into skincare, the reason we do like vitamin C serums is to protect against free radicals. But anyway, so we're almost done. Sorry, thank you for holding on for this. So just a quick check. So it says a photon of which color of light would contain more energy: yellow, which is 590 nanometers, or purple, which is 410 nanometers. So go ahead and answer that. So the answer would be purple, right? The 410 nanometers. So the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. So a shorter wavelength, meaning the one that has 410 instead of 590, will have higher energy. All right, and then just contrast heterotrophs and autotrophs. I'll give you a second to do that. And just remember, autotrophs produce their own food from their surroundings, while heterotrophs rely on other organisms for food. Okay, so that is the end. I know it's long-winded, but this is only a third of the photosynthesis stuff that we'll go over. So just be prepared. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Okay, and I apologize for my stuffy nose and inability to breathe. Have a great day, guys.